Today our presentation is going to be revolving around the concept of juvenile homicides. So I'll start the presentation off by first discussing a few facts, statistics, and definitions regarding juvenile murder. And after this, we'll have Talar, who will be discussing aspects of teen homicides. Then Dakota will be providing a few examples of juvenile murderers, going over the cases, the trials, and the punishments. And then lastly, Isaac will discuss the concept of juvenile punishments in comparison to adult punishments and the death penalty as well. So first of all, a brief definition of juvenile murder is that it is simply a murder that is committed by a juvenile. So in most states, a juvenile is someone under the age of 18. However, some states this can be 16 or 17, or in the state of Wyoming, the age is actually 19. So to get into more of these statistics, we see that in the United States, the amount of juvenile killers is alarmingly high. The rate of murder among teens is 10 times higher than in Western Europe, and it's 70 times higher than in Japan. Unfortunately, the rate of juvenile homicides has increased moderately, beginning in 2010 from just 6.6 teenage killers per 100,000 in 2013 to 8.7 in 2017. However, this number is a pretty drastic decrease from the year 1994, when the rate was over 20 teenage killers per every 100,000 teenagers. So we can split up these juvenile killers into 4 different categories for the most part. So these categories are divided based on the motives to the murders. So first, there's the angry, or he has built up frustration and he acts usually out of anger or passion. And then there's the teen who murders a family member or a friend, primarily because of an ongoing problem within the relationship. And then there's also those individuals who kill while in the commission of a crime. Say they are performing a home invasion, a robbery, anything like that. And they end up killing someone. We know that these murders are typically not premeditated, but they just happen just due to the situation. And then the last type is the school shooter. So there's a few circumstances that can actually increase the likelihood that a teenager or a juvenile engages in murder. So a few of these are being a history of being abused or neglected, gang membership, and a family history of criminal violence. Now, these 3 right here increase the likelihood of a juvenile being a murderer by double, and then the risk of these will then triple the risk, which are having a gun in the house, school difficulties, poor attendance, history of arrest, and having a neurological disorder, which Talar is actually going to be discussing later on. So when we look at why some of these juveniles are engaging in murder, few explanations that some people propose are that it's because there's an increase in the availability of guns in the United States. It becomes significantly easier now for people to get their hands on guns, especially because a lot of people actually have them in their homes. That's where we see a lot of these teenagers actually getting the guns from when they commit murder. Alongside this, there's a breakdown of the nuclear family and neighborhoods and communities. So we see that divorce rates are higher than ever. For a lot of families are unstable, and this leads to a little bit of confusion and conflict in the life of these individuals. Alongside that, there's violence on television and in movies. The media is portraying violence pretty frequently that these teenagers are commonly seeing. And then alongside that, there's a natural tendency for teens to form groups and cliques, which I will focus on the importance of that later in the presentation. So when you look at the location as to where these murders are actually taking place, a majority of them are taking place in public. So they're taking place in parks or in and around schoolyards. The cases that are taking place in private are usually where a family member, a brother, a sister, mother, father, someone like that is killed, and that's going to be taking place inside the offender's home. So we look at the differences between male and female juvenile killers, And we see that the girls only account for 10% of teen murders, and their victim is usually a parent, boyfriend, or their own child. It's usually someone that they're related to. Now, looking at the victims of these murderers, it can be seen that male and female killers tend to have a completely different set of victims. 53% of juvenile male killers target friends or acquaintances, while only about 33% kill strangers, leaving that last fraction of them actually killing their family members. But that's what we see the majority of the female offenders actually killing. At 46%, they're killing, 46% of the time, they're actually killing a family member. 41% of the time, they're killing an acquaintance. And then the last percent they're just killing random individuals. But one thing that we do see in common is that the victims are typically male, no matter the gender of the perpetrator, where 85% of boys and 70% of girls killed males. These are typically friends, fathers, or brothers. Another difference between the two genders is the method of murder and the weapons that are being used. In slightly 2/3 of murders, the teenage boy is going to be using a gun, and the knife is second most common at 18%. But in female offenders, they're only using a gun 42% of the time, and using the knife 33% of the time. So they're twice as likely to be using a knife as compared to a gun when they're committing a murder. As I mentioned earlier, the concept of becoming a member of a group or a clique in turn leads to group killing, which is a large and growing problem, because this is when a number of juveniles kill in groups of 2 or more, and this has skyrocketed since the 1980s. We see that 77% of all killings are actually being committed by a single offender. However, 14% involve 2 offenders, and that remaining percent right there is going to be 3 offenders or more. But a large issue with this is that these group killings typically are gang-related, and it's a cross-racial killing, where we see only 11% of single offender killings involve a victim and offenders of 2 different races, and interracial attacks are involved in a quarter of group kills. Right there, that's just a little bit of the basics, some statistics, and the definitions that are associated with juvenile homicide. Now, following me, Talar is going to be discussing the psychological aspect of why and how these teenagers are engaging in homicides.
Drew. So I did the psychological aspect behind juvenile homicides and potential reasons for what is going on inside of their brain when they are committing these acts. The way I did it is, as a psych major, we look at a lot of disorders and a lot of causes for things from the biopsychosocial model, which is 3 parts. You look at biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors. What's important to note is that no one is the same, so no one has the same experiences, and the reason someone commits these acts is all different. There's not one solid explanation for these. For the biological part of it, some possible theories can include hormone levels, which peak of antisocial behavior, especially in juveniles when you're reaching adolescence. Your hormones are all over the place, and this is a time where antisocial behavior is very high, which it has increased testosterone, which could be excessive violence in teenage boys, which are why young males are more at risk for aggressive behavior. But it can also happen with females. Another explanation is neurological dysfunction. And that is, children with disturbed behaviors may have neurological deficits, which is damage to brain hemispheres. And damage can lead to reduction of executive functioning, which is really important because that impairs your cognitive processes that help with planning and regulating goal-oriented behaviors. It can also lead to schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, alcoholism, antisocial behaviors, and conduct disorder. The teenage brain is still developing, and that means your amygdala and frontal lobe are still developing. And your amygdala is aggressive behavior linked. So that is the area that processes information regarding threats and fears. And if that's still developing, then you're not going to process those things in a normal way if you were a little more older and your brain was more developed. This obviously doesn't happen in everyone, but it could be a potential reason. And then there's less activity in your frontal lobe, which is your brain region responsible for decision making and impulse control, which again, if that's not fully developed, then you could impulsively be doing, in this case, committing murders, which you wouldn't have done if your brain was more developed, and your decision making is a little out there, so that's the decision you would end up making if this were the reason. Young boys mostly may overreact to their surroundings, feel threatened, and act out aggressively, in this case, committing murders. A psychological explanation could be attachment theory, which is very important when you are born. It's your attachment with your caregiver, which is usually your parents. So that's an emotional bond to someone, and it has lasting psychological implications throughout the rest of your life. If you create an insecure attachment, that is a detachment that could lead to detachment problems with antisocial behavior, which can include sexual assault and child abuse. And with an insecure attachment, you have a harder time making and maintaining relationships, which could explain why murderers are less empathetic, because if you don't have a relationship, or you don't know a relationship, or you care about someone, you're not necessarily going to care about what you end up doing to them. Different mental disorders that could possibly be linked to juvenile homicide are oppositional defiant disorder, which is an ongoing pattern of uncooperative, defiant, and hostile behavior towards authority figures that seriously interferes with day-to-day functioning, as well as loss of temper, arguing with adults, breaking rules, misbehaving, and are resentful. Antisocial substance disorder, it could also be a link, which is when adolescents engage in risky antisocial and drug-using behaviors, which suppresses neural activity, and they stray away from norms and act in more deviant ways. This is very important to know, because when you are under the influence, you don't necessarily do things that you would do if you weren't. And if you're engaging in more risky situations while under the influence, that could lead to more damaging things. Other mental disorders that could possibly be linked are borderline personality disorder, which is intense and unstable emotions and quickly shifting moods within someone, and they have a hard time controlling their emotions, which could lead to impulsive behaviors, substance abuse, risky sex, self-injury, and binge eating. Conduct disorder is another one, which you are severely antisocial, which is a major one that a lot of researchers might think have the strongest link to murders, and that can include bullying, fighting, committing sexual assault, cruelty towards animals, and rule breaking. Schizophrenia is another mental disorder that could possibly be linked, and that is a combination of hallucinations, delusions, and extremely disordered thinking and behavior that impairs daily functioning. Hallucinations are perception of having seen, heard, touched, tasted, or smelled something that wasn't there, and delusions are a belief or altered reality that is persistently held despite evidence or argument to the contrary. That's obviously something sad, because they can't always control that. That's usually something people are born with, but it's hard for them to go against that because they believe in it so much. So if a delusion is someone saying you have to kill someone, then they're going to believe that that's the only thing to do to stop a voice in their head that's telling them to do that. For the social part of the biopsychosocial model, I looked at different studies, and both of these studies noticed two main key things. One is the greater availability of guns in their homes, in a juvenile's home, so they are more likely to report having taken guns from their home. So when they have greater access to firearms, that gives them a greater chance of committing a murder. And another one is a greater incidence of substance abuse at the time of their offenses. So again, if you're under the influence, that causes you to act in a different way than you would if you wouldn't. And if there are firearms around, what's to say that a kid won't just pick it up and use it? without rationally making a decision if it's a good idea or not. It's also found that juveniles belong to low socioeconomic status, history of school dropout, pro-criminal activity, behavior disorders, crime, and violent behaviors are also things that could predict someone committing homicide. And a lot of that has to do with the strain theory that we learned, which if they're under they have these strains against them, they may be forced to act in other ways to reach goals that they need, and possibly murder could be one of those ways that they think that is the only way. Another study showed family and community influences. So adolescents living with parents and guardians who were mentally ill had a 7.4 times greater chance of being arrested for homicide in the future. Belonging to a criminal organization has shown to be a risk factor for homicidal conduct. And that was shown in several studies. And participation in gangs were also more prevalent for kids who committed homicide. And that can go with the social learning theory. So if your role models and people around you are acting in such criminal ways, though that might be what you grew up with, so that's what you think is the thing to do. And that's what you end up doing when you're older, or as in this case, a juvenile. And psychiatrists say that there is no one type of youthful killer, but they often do come from families where they have seen or experienced a lot of violence. And another study showed economic status. So low socioeconomic status has been recognized as a correlate with higher rates of certain types of offenses, especially homicide. And then these are my sources, and that's the psychological aspect. Off to you, Dakota.
Hello everybody, Dakota Botter here. Today I want to talk about specific cases involving juvenile homicide. First case being the execution of George Steiny Jr., 1944. It's happened in a small town, South Carolina. George was accused of murdering two Caucasian girls, Betty June, Mary Ann. Betty June being 11 years old and Mary Ann 7. George was eventually found guilty, and he was the youngest male of the 20th century to be executed. On the electric chair, the first try did not work. George was too small to fit, so he was forced to sit on a Bible along with multiple other books, and so he would be tall enough for the electric chair to work. George Steiny Jr., aka the scapegoat. During the process of George's case, there was multiple red flags. See, he was questioned by the police for less than 1 hour. The questioning involved no lawyer, and no parents were present. The jury consists of all white males, and during the duration where the jury talked about whether George was guilty or not, it took less than 10 minutes, of which he was found guilty. You see, the family was threatened to be lynched by people of the community, so they were forced to leave town, and part of George's alibi was his sister. George and his sister were outside playing during the time of Betty June Mary Ann's murder. But because his sister was forced to leave town, he had no alibi, causing the police a great reasoning to find him guilty. Next case I want to talk about is by Cyntoia Brown Long. Her early life consisted of her mother and father unknown. She didn't really know him too well. Her mother was an alcoholic, and after her giving birth to Cyntoia, she became addicted to crack cocaine and definitely was an alcoholic during the time. So there's multiple possibilities of birth defect or probability of her alcoholism affecting the birth of Cyntoia. Eventually, her mother gave her up for adoption, and during her time during DCS, she fled multiple homes, of which eventually, when she was 16, she was living with her boyfriend at the time, of who she thought was her boyfriend, and her boyfriend was using her as a sex trafficking girl, right? Was forcing her into sex trafficking and selling her body for money. One of these cases of the murder of Johnny Allen. Brown was 16, accused of murdering Allen, who was 43. Allen paid Brown's boyfriend for sex with Brown. While alone with Allen, Brown refused to have sex, Scared for her life, Centoya shot and killed Alan, robbed him, stole all his belongings. She did this because, one, she knew if she came home to her boyfriend with no money, she would get beat. Her boyfriend would abuse her. She would be in trouble. So she did this in order to help herself. You know, she didn't want to have sex with the guy, but she also didn't want to get beat by her boyfriend. So she robbed him so that way her boyfriend could have something, right? Gain something out of this kind of event. During her trial, she was tried as an adult at 16 years old, you know, and the jury, the she was constantly referred to as a teen prostitute, but she was being sex trafficked, which is doesn't make any sense, you know. And she argued it was self defense. She's 16 years old, being sex trafficked to all these guys out there, and constantly referred to as a prostitute. You know, she was sentenced to life without a chance of parole until she was 51. You know, for first degree murder and armed robbery. But in her eyes, she was protecting herself. She didn't want to have sex. She didn't want to have to like fight her boyfriend, you know. She was protecting herself, and they did not see it like that. Eventually, Centoya's story goes viral. During her time in jail, she earned 2 university degrees. She found God. She was actually ended up marrying Jamie Long, who was a successful rapper, and she appealed for clemency. And this appeal was founded by multiple celebrities, including LeBron James and Rihanna, who backed her in her story. She was eventually found. She was eventually exonerated, and she wrote a book about her story. The jury eventually seen her as a girl being sex trafficked, okay, and found her not guilty. The next story, is actually one I found that is going to be told from the kid himself. I found this online, and it's from a TV show called Kids Behind Bars, and I'll let the story speak for itself.
The majority of teenagers at Wabash are in for sentences of 10 years or less. However, being tried as adults means that those who have committed horrific crimes will spend much of their life in prison.
I'm Jesus from State of Perez. I'm 17 years old, and I got sentenced to 65 years for murder.
Jesus has been involved in gangs from a young age.
I've been jumped, I've been hit with bats, I got stabbed in my leg, I've been shot at. Like, ain't nothing new to me. Like, I see this every day. Like, feel me? I live this life. Feel me? Feel me? It ain't nothing. So I never got shot though, surprisingly.
One June evening, out driving with friends in his hometown of Elkhart, he spotted a rival and an argument began.
He was throwing gang signs or something. And he said like, I don't know, he said something. I got possessed or something, like something came over me. That's when I felt like something just, that's when I felt that.
In a fit of anger, Jesus fired one shot.
I seen his face too, like, I remember seeing him like, you know, a surprise face.
16-year-old Braxton Barhams was dead.
I know that, like, me and him didn't get along, but damn, I just took his life. Like, what the fuck, what did I just do?
Jesus is now spending 65 years at Wabash, reflecting on that one moment.
I guess I don't like talking about it or something.
What's the main reason you're not talking about it?
Cause that's what changed my life. That's what, that's what changed everything. That's like, I feel like when that happened, my life stopped too. Like, cause I don't know, like everything else is like just gone.
That is all the cases I have. These are just a couple inside looks of homicides by juveniles. Now brings us to Isaacs. He's going to talk today about homicide and transfers and punishment.
Thanks for that intro. Hey everyone. Nice to see all of you again. Dr. Early, I love the tie. My name is Isaac Cato. I'm going to talk about juvenile homicide transfers and punishments today. So starting with the adult court transfer. This is one of the most significant moments in a juvenile court hearing. The potential transfer to the adult court, otherwise known as the transfer process. All 50 states currently allow some sort of juvenile transfer to adult courts, meaning that if they want, either the judge or the prosecution will get into the different methods and techniques that the different parties can go through. They have the option to try the juvenile as an adult. This is especially relevant for juvenile homicide, as it's one of the most obviously severe cases that someone can be charged with, homicide, the death of someone. So I thought that talking about the transfer process is pretty important, since it is fairly common in homicide cases. And there are 3 different types of transfer jurisdictions. There's concurrent, statutory, and judicial waivers. So starting with concurrent jurisdiction, we'll talk about this first. It exists in 14 states today and gives the prosecution the discretion of certain charges in either the juvenile or adult criminal court. Basically what this means is it gives the prosecution or the prosecuting attorney the power to decide if they want to move any charges up to the adult court, and if so, which ones. So it's kind of a selective process. They can pick and choose. If there's multiple charges that have been filed, they can choose which one they want to move up to the adult court. So it gives a lot of power to the prosecuting attorney in this case scenario. Concurrent jurisdiction does not require the prosecution to file all of the charges in juvenile or adult court, but allows them to pick and choose rather which charges are filed in which court. So again, they're not required. If there's 3 charges that have been filed, they don't have to move all 3 up to the adult court. They can maybe just choose one that they think. Second type, statutory exclusion policies. So statutory exclusion policies exist in 29 states today. And this policy excludes a wide variety of offenses from juvenile court automatically. Basically what this means is different states obviously have different laws. So certain states have automatic exclusions. So no matter what the crime, what the circumstances are, if a juvenile commits a certain crime in a certain state, they'll automatically be tried in an adult court. And again, each state has different offenses that they exclude that to be automatically moved up to adult court. So these offenses that are automatically excluded vary on a range from as minor as a traffic violation to as serious as capital murder. So in the case of juvenile homicides, there are some states that automatically will have an exclusion saying if a juvenile commits a homicide, it's automatically going to be moved up to adult court. It's not going to be charged in juvenile court. This obviously isn't the case in every state, but it varies from state to state. And these policies account for the largest amount of juveniles being tried as adults. So these basically, I think of them kind of like as brackets. These brackets that kind of lump charges and move them into the adult courts are what account for the largest percentage of juveniles being tried as adults in America today. Lastly, judicial waiver. So this is the last type of transfer to the adult courts. This waiver allows a juvenile court judge to hold a hearing to decide whether or not to waive the jurisdiction and transfer it over to the adult criminal court. Basically, giving the power back to the juvenile court judge, and he can decide whether or not the charges should be moved up to the adult court, or if the juvenile court should retain jurisdiction and they should be tried as juvenile. So 44 states use this waiver as a way of transferring juveniles to the adult courts today. So not only for homicides, but for any other crimes or cases that they might run into. So those are the 3 kinds of adult transfers that occur today in America, through the 3 main ones. And I know some of the numbers were a little bit skewed. This one's 44. I believe statutory was 29. Yeah, 29 states. I think some states utilize multiple practices in determining and it will depend on the case scenario and obviously the crime and maybe other mitigating circumstances. So that's why they didn't add up exactly to 50. So now moving on, we're going to talk about potential punishments for adults. So let's just say that the case has happened where a juvenile is being charged with homicide, and the state has made the decision that they're going to be tried as an adult. So if they were to be convicted, what are the potential punishments for a homicide? So as we know, the death penalty is still legal in a majority of America, 25 states to be exact, according to deathpenaltyinfo.org. So half of America, the death penalty is still available, or not available, but legal. It's still used as a means of trying to deter crime, I guess. So for adults convicted, homicide would meet their qualifications for the death penalty in states where it is legal. That's a little bit of a generalization. There's a little bit more specification that needs to be met, usually reserved for first-degree murder, but that is technically a homicide. So for adults convicted, homicide does meet the qualifications in most case scenarios. For states that have abolished the death penalty, incarceration for life without the possibility for parole is absolutely an option, but what about juveniles? So we'll get to that in a minute. So for states like Michigan, where the death penalty is legal, obviously homicide is a serious matter, serious crime to be committed, and if it turns out that the adult is convicted, life without the possibility of parole is definitely an option. Obviously, it's not going to be the case for everyone who's convicted of homicide, but it's definitely on the table when either the judge or, whoever is deciding sentencing. So now we're going to talk about life without the possibility of parole for juveniles, because it works a little bit differently for juveniles as opposed to adults. But first we got to look over this case that really kind of set the framework for abolishing the death penalty for juveniles, and that's Roper versus Simmons. So quick brief, Christopher Simmons was 17 years old when he committed the murder of Shirley Crook in Missouri. He was sentenced to death under Missouri law that allowed the death penalty for minors convicted of capital murder. So Missouri law at the time, I think this was in the 90s, it was in the mid-90s, 1994 actually, allowed the death penalty for minors convicted of capital murder. So juveniles that committed a homicide, capital murder, whatever you want to call it, Missouri law stated that the death penalty was reasonable. So he appealed 9 years later in 2003. The Missouri State Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty violated minors' Eighth Amendment right against cruel and unusual punishments due to evolving standards of decency. So that's the explanation that the Missouri Supreme Court gave as to why the death penalty was unconstitutional in the state of Missouri. 2 years later, the United States Supreme Court upheld this ruling in 2005, making the death penalty unconstitutional for any crime for juveniles in the United States. So 2005, Supreme Court rules death penalty is unconstitutional because it violates their Eighth Amendment right against cruel and unusual punishment due to evolving standards of decency. So basically meaning, as time goes on, it's seen to be undecent or indecent now to subject a juvenile to the death penalty. So now that the death penalty has been ruled unconstitutional, in the case scenario where a juvenile was being tried for a homicide as a minor, if the death penalty isn't a potential sentencing option, the next would probably be life without the possibility of parole. We talked about how it works for your adults, no problem whatsoever. A lot of homicides will qualify for life without the possibility of parole if there's other mitigating circumstances, things like that, or aggravating factors. But for juveniles, it's a little different. As the death penalty was abolished for juveniles, the issue of life incarceration without the possibility for parole was established. In 2010, so 5 years after they abolished the death penalty for juveniles, the United States Supreme Court ruled that life without parole for juveniles who committed non-homicide crimes was unconstitutional and violated juveniles' Eighth Amendment right amendment against cruel and unusual punishment, leaving life sentences without parole as an option only for juveniles convicted of a homicide. So, in 2010, the United States Supreme Court rules that juveniles who have committed non-homicide crimes cannot be given life without the possibility of parole, as again, it violates their Eighth Amendment right against cruel, unusual punishment. This only reserved it for juveniles convicted of a homicide. So as of 2010, if you did commit a homicide, you could technically be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. But this changed 2 years later. The United States Supreme Court ruled that life sentences without parole possibility could not be imposed automatically. stating that circumstances and factors need to be looked at before assessing life without parole as punishment for a homicide. So, while it still remains legal, it wouldn't be the automatic deferment for a sentencing. There would have to be circumstances and factors that need to be assessed potentially by the judge for that to be sentenced. So, didn't necessarily abolish it, but definitely made it a lot more difficult for judges to give that sentence out to juveniles. So, while juveniles can receive a life sentence without the possibility of parole in America today, that sentence is not automatic, and other factors and issues must be considered by the court before that sentence is served. And that's all I've got to say. So, thank you guys so much for watching. This is my Works Cited. And Dr. Early, again, I love the tie. Got mine on. Davion, nice to see you. Guys, have a great rest of the semester. Bye.